assess the costs or the impact on access to critical clinical tests. Next slide, please. So we're left with one major concern and a couple of risks. The major concern is that there are no specifics on which we can even judge the impact of the proposed FDA oversight of LDTs on either laboratories or on access to esoteric and innovative testing. The risk that we see is that we can lose access to those tests, our patients will lose access, and that small innovative laboratories will end up closed because of the financial impact of compliance with the regulatory proposals that have thus far been put out. Next slide, please. Oh, you've got it. So today we have 4 speakers in addition to myself. First will be Sylvia Trujillo. She is the Senior Washington Counsel for the American Medical Association. She'll be discussing a comparison and contrast of the Diagnostic Test Working Group proposal, the FDA guidance, and CLIA enhancement models that many members of the laboratory community have been developing through a consortium. Next up will be Dr. James Evans. Dr. Evans is board certified in internal medicine, clinical molecular genetics, and in clinical genetics. He's at the University of North Carolina and will be discussing the implications of LDT oversight for laboratories and their patients. And next up will be the tag team that will discuss the legislative backdrop on which we're operating. David Liss, who is Vice President for External Affairs of BioReference Laboratories and GeneDx, and Dr. Mark Rodman, who is the President and CEO of BioReference Laboratories and GeneDx, will be discussing that legislative backdrop. So a quick comment on some of the logistics. There's a question and answer box on your screen that you can identify. We'll be taking questions. You can submit them at any point during the webinar, and we will be collecting them and responding them at the end of the talks. So our first speaker is Sylvia Trujillo with AMA, discussing reform models and the optimal pathway for regulation of LDTs. Sylvia?
Great. Thank you, Mike. First of all, I'd like to emphasize that this is a great opportunity from the AMA's perspective to ensure that those clinicians who are impacted on the front lines to new regulatory reform models have an opportunity to understand the various proposals, evaluate based on their experience and subject matter expertise, the impact, and provide in a constructive and positive way feedback to their members on the way in which this can be done to ensure ongoing patient access, quality testing, and that other important objectives are met. I would like to have us move to the next slide, and it is a bit of a duplication of the points that Mike made, but they bear emphasis. In talking to all the stakeholders who have very disparate views around what a reform model should be, there is consensus that is a marked departure from where the AMA, frankly, and others started, which is that modernization is required. The last major reform in the clinical lab space was in 1988, and essentially I think we can all agree that there's been a tremendous revolution in clinical testing and increasing complexity and tremendous growth, and that this is an opportunity for clinicians and physicians and other providers to take a prominent role in influencing what the modernization looks like. To that end, moving to the next slide, the AMA, along with the consortium that Mike identified, sat down, really drilled down to figure out what the goal should be in promoting an oversight framework that works not just for today, but for the next several decades. And first and foremost, not only were there issues around quality testing and accelerating innovation, but we heard very clearly that ordering clinicians felt it very important that there was transparency, largely due to the fact that I think many of them did not understand the specificity already that existed with regard to oversight in the CLIA context, but certainly there was an acknowledgement that there was a need for greater transparency. In addition, any modernization model from a provider perspective should build on the tradition of the medical commons, that the regulation under the CLA framework really had been and has been agile and effective, largely due to leveraging the benefits of shared information in the commons. Lastly, but not certainly least, has been over the past year a growing acknowledgement from every stakeholder across the continuum that there's not just the need to ensure access for these new innovative tests, but in fact, the clinical laboratory community is a network. It prevents they are the front line that prevents mass epidemics that could emerge very rapidly, but for the fact that we have a very diverse ecosystem of clinical laboratories that serve as the front line for detection and development of tests that do detect the emergence of infectious diseases. And we are now in an era of biothreats where the role of clinical labs in local communities is very important. Bearing all those goals in mind, moving to the next slide, we did sit down and think about this broadly, and the issue wasn't simply how do we modernize and enhance the framework for tests performed and offered in the context of a CLIA laboratory, but also it's very clear we had been hearing that manufacturers had been operating under a very onerous regulatory regime that had tremendously constrained their ability to take their commercial kits where they had invested a tremendous amount in commercialization and ensure that they remained current and specifically to address modifications and that the FDA device framework that they operate under as a product that is mass distributed has to comply with. And so we sat down and we identified what we thought were areas that reform for them in particular and the products that they do would be very important. And that's an important starting point on that parallel trajectory because it does have implications for the way in which we think about modifications in the context of LDTs, particularly to the extent that we are now looking at reform models that contemplate a targeted role for FDA, albeit for high risk, and I'll get to that. So moving to the next slide, 11. On the CLIA front, one of the things that we've emphasized is, of course, there's already a stratification that occurs for low, moderate, high complexity tests, and really we're talking about focusing on a subset of high complexity tests that are laboratory developed tests and services and really building a stratification of risk approach for purposes of oversight given limited resources. And as you can see, this stratification is largely as a result of consensus generated by specialty societies, ACMG, CAP, ASCP, and AMP. We'll delve into that a little bit more, and in particular the definition of what's high and moderate risk, which has become two of the, I think, lightning rods of discussion around the reform model. But moving to slide 12, I just want to ensure that everyone as a starting point and as a threshold in communicating your views and thinking through this issue, understand that there is a consensus around what needs to happen in the context of CLIA modernization. There is a strong view that laboratory-developed tests that are moderate and high risk do need documentation of clinical validation and analytical validity, and that in the context of high risk and moderate risk tests, that this would occur prior to these being offered, that documentation and review would occur before patients started to receive the test. And this has tremendous implications for how you provide care and also how the regulators would operationalize such a tremendous and different way of doing clinical practice and regulatory oversight. We think the transparency piece is quite easy once you do the third piece, which is strengthen the requirements around the role of accreditors and expanding a role for third-party reviewers, which unquestionably you would need in the context of requiring heightened review and scrutiny of both moderate and high-risk tests. So moving to the next slide, this brings us to really where there is a divergence in view around how you would operationalize that. So to the right, you see in green the role of specialty societies and provider communities who've determined that really this should be building off the existing CLA framework, and those that are more along the continuum where the FDA believes that they should regulate low, moderate, and high-risk tests on top of the existing CLA regulatory requirements. And in addition, we have sort of gradations or versions of that FDA guidance in the context of the AVAMED proposal, which seeks to have the regulatory regime under the device amendments, and a proposal by the Diagnostic Test Work Group that very well-meaning individuals, but also would not necessarily and has not yet addressed really what we think are significant issues, but are addressing issues that we think are important and that there may be convergence around. Namely, we're tremendously concerned about the volume that the DTWG would have going through their reform model because it's inclusive of both moderate and high-risk tests under the auspices of the FDA. So moving to slide 14, there also is a concern, I think, with those who are FDA-centric versus CLIA-centric, that there's a disagreement that the physician and provider community does not believe that the activities of physicians and providers to develop, design, validate, perform tests is equivalent to the activities of manufacturers who mass produce and design commercial kits that are engineered for standard patients and shipped around the country. Now, in the context of the provider proposal, there's a clear acknowledgement that these are different activities. The FDA tries to address these issues as mitigating factors for basically down-classifying or treating oversight as something that is discretionary. And the congressional proposal that's now in the House would treat this issue as a mitigating factor. Having said this, we think it's just a misapprehension of how medicine is practiced as well as how manufacturing is performed. Once again, this next slide is a reframing of the issue and underlying and underscoring that there is a difference between a service that's provided to individual patients where there's a relationship with the ordering physician and those who developed and performed the test, the feedback loop, the fact that it's happening in a discrete set of laboratories where the expertise is enhanced by performing over and over again relative to a commercial kit that is distributed to many different places. Moving on to slide 16, under additional key differences, in looking at the treatment of high risk, there's strong concordance amongst the provider community around what constitutes a high-risk test. And there is a diversity of views on the side of those who support an FDA-centric approach, with those in the DTWG group providing that most of the oversight would occur within the FDA for moderate and high risk, but acknowledging in a much more nuanced way than the FDA's proposal, which is, as Mike said, a faith-based approach. We don't really know under the FDA guidance what will be high, what will be moderate, what will be low risk, around what tests would be high and low risk. I would emphasize that the key issue here for the provider community is not just the impact on the patient, but really the ability of the medical commons to clinically validate and analytically validate those tests. So a key part of what the provider community is focusing on in the context of high risk is, do we have the capacity or can we build the capacity to keep this within a CLIA accredited or third-party review model to meaningfully look at these high-risk tests? Is it a algorithm that cannot be validated by a third-party reviewer or accreditor? looking at the analytical performance, for example. Moving on to slide 17, one of the interesting issues that's emerged that we're really looking to the provider community to provide greater insights into is around what is emerging to be one of the big sticking points between an FDA-centric approach and a CLIA-centric approach is really what the implications would be of complying for your laboratory with FDA quality systems requirements and other compliance provisions under the device amendments, or even under a whole new legislatively created creature of legislative requirements, regulatory requirements rather, for your moderate risk test. So even if you look at high risk and we're able to say we can develop a compliance model where the FDA conducts their review of these tests, which is highly speculative at this juncture, and certainly we think it's going to be a fairly large volume. When you add in moderate risk, our questions and concerns really revolve around your capacity to come into compliance and the regulator's ability to do so as well. So moving on to the next slide. So moving to that threw me for a second. Our animation is actually working. So moving to the next slide and getting close to wrapping up here is that we have been able to engage with a broad group of stakeholders to find areas of agreement where there's convergence, that there's questions about the FDA guidance, but also questions that apply across the board to all of the regulatory models, and ensuring that we have good answers to the issues that are raised with regard to these. And namely, we need to make sure that any of the models maintain an adequate network of clinical laboratories that can perform a sentinel function, that we don't squeeze the network to the point where many laboratories cease to be operational and we lose and become vulnerable to public health outbreaks of infectious diseases and biothreats. I think there's also a growing convergence, irrespective of what agency is regulating, around what the evidentiary requirements should be for high and moderate risk tests, but I think that your perspective and views would be quite welcome. I also think we can safely say that everyone is equally concerned about the economic impact and ascertaining not just what the impact would be under a CLIA-centric model, but also an FDA-centric model. We know that for laboratories, a CLIA model for the regulated would be less burdensome, but we do know that the actual agency may require significant expansion of capacity, and that is very much true for the FDA, despite what they've, I think, represented to others. And then lastly, we think that there is broad agreement that the treatment of modifications under the FDA guidance is tremendously problematic and has been historically. That brings me lastly to my final page about capacity of the regulators and the regulated. I think at this juncture, we are asking you all to think very carefully, taking the ACMG risk categorization for tests and to evaluate what it would mean if your laboratory would have to register all of your tests, if they then would have to categorize the tests along that ACMG as a sort of a straw man categorization, and then run what you consider to be high risk on that framework through an FDA model, and then what would happen if you had to run the moderate risk ones as well. I say that as a straw man to evaluate impact is because we don't have the time today, and we probably won't have the time after many of these to run through with specificity every one of the reform models, but I think your ability to speak substantively and specifically using that as a straw man basis for evaluating impact on your lab will be tremendously helpful. I thank you for your time, and I turn it back to Mike.
All right. Thank you very much, Sylvia. It was very informative background on the LDT oversight. Next up is Dr. Jim Evans. Jim's going to talk to us about the potential impact of the regulation of laboratory tests on the practice of medicine, on the costs of compliance, and on the meeting of risk. Jim?
Great. Thanks, Mike. So my name is Jim Evans, and I think it's important at the outset to really articulate why I'm interested in this topic. I don't run a laboratory. I'm board certified in molecular diagnostics, but I don't run a lab. Really, my life won't be that affected with regard to what kind of regulation is imposed on this field. But my patients will be impacted dramatically, and I therefore, as both a general internist and as a practicing geneticist, have a huge interest in this. I would also point out that in addition to an interest in ensuring that we have a nimble, diverse testing capacity that can really respond to the needs of patients and providers, we don't have a bad system now. I think there's clearly room for improvement, and I think there are schemes out there that can accomplish that improvement. But I want to emphasize that this current system, I don't see it as a provider as being really broken. We can go on to the next slide. I want to emphasize that we have tried to come up at the University of North Carolina with some rough costs of compliance. It's difficult, of course, because we don't know precisely what is going to ensue, but I think it's a very safe bet to postulate that under the FDA's current scheme, laboratories would be required to register their tests. If you look at our core laboratory, and these figures that I'm going to talk about were really generated by my colleague, Catherine Hammett-Stabler, who directs the core laboratories, we currently offer 258 laboratory-developed tests and 103 modified tests. I think it's instructive to consider what the minimal costs would be for complying with simply registration of LDTs. And, of course, that is going to imply registering modifications. And as those of you who deal with laboratories on a day-to-day basis know, modifications are a significant component of any lab's menu. This would be, for example, testing fluids beyond serum or urine, or, quote, unintended uses. And a good example would be the use of HCG for anything other than pregnancy testing, as we know is commonly done in the practice of medicine. So if you go on to the next slide, what you can see is our general estimates of what this would cost. And for our core laboratory, we're talking about a $1 to $3 million cost per registration period, whether that be annual or whether it would be every 2 or 3 years, hard to say. The costs for 510 compliance would be an order of magnitude greater, and full PMA cost would be astronomically larger. The bottom line is that even with only registration or notification required, the test menu that would be offered by academic and most other labs will plummet. For example, ARUP estimates that about 98% of their offered tests would be eliminated. Now, there's no question that will incur cost, and that cost will be passed on to payers and ultimately to a significant extent to patients. And that's a problem. I'm at a public institution. Many of my patients have bare bones insurance, and there's no question that will impact them. But I worry even more about the impact on the general landscape of testing. As I mentioned at the outset, we really have a pretty nimble, responsive testing landscape out there. That will simply not be the case if the currently envisioned regulatory framework is adopted. What we will end up with, quite predictably, are a very few very large labs that will be the only ones who have deep enough pockets to comply with these kinds of regulatory costs. So this kind of regulation, and it's a really well-established economic principle in that literature, will drive the field towards monopolies and oligopolies. We've been down that road before. Most of you remember just a few years ago when we only had one laboratory that could do the RCA 1 and 2 testing. That was not good for patients, and it changed on January 13, 2013, when the Supreme Court ruled that you couldn't patent genes. But we've really done that experiment. We've seen what happens when one has a monopoly or an oligopoly, and it's just not a good situation. So I don't think it's hyperbolic to say that the proposed regulation by the FDA represents an existential threat to most laboratories and therefore a threat to patient care. I want to start to wrap up by going to the next slide, which is a very short discussion of clinical validity in medical practice. The use and the full interpretation of laboratory tests really aren't under the exclusive purview of a clinical laboratory. We interact regularly with our laboratorians to point out that this would be a test that would be worth bringing up. This is a test that probably doesn't do much good. It's unrealistic to think that the FDA can adjudicate clinical validity as well outside their scope of expertise, as would, for example, it being totally unrealistic to think we could have RCTs, for example, to demonstrate clinical validity of each test. The point that I'd like to make is that clinical validity can be assessed and is being assessed by established mechanisms. For example, ClinGen, publicly funded effort, has a metric by which we are currently evaluating clinical validity. We don't need to reinvent the wheel, and we don't need to ask the FDA to invent a wheel when we actually have mechanisms by which we can adjudicate and assess clinical validity that are largely based on the medical literature. And finally, going to the last slide, I would encourage those regulatory schemes and oversight schemes that understandably want to focus on high risk to not think so much about just the test. You give me a laboratory test, and I can spin a very plausible, realistic clinical scenario that makes that test high risk or low risk. Rather, I think we should look at where the problems have been, and it's pretty clear where the problems have been. They have been when ridiculous and unsubstantiated claims are made. When dramatic claims are made, such as tumor detection through blood analysis, we should require dramatic evidence. When we are dealing with proprietary and opaque tests, that is black boxes, we should recognize that those are what's riskiest and should be the primary target for regulatory scrutiny. Claims that are not consistent with a body of medical literature. Look out there at claims that are made by nutrigenomics companies, etc. And finally, when we see aggressive marketing of laboratory tests, we should recognize that the cart has been put before the horse, and that is a signal of risk. If you look, for example, at the 20 case studies that the FDA released several months ago, you'll see that the problems that are identified are generally based on false and exaggerated claims by laboratories that aggressively market their products. So I think that there are better ways to assess risk and focus on those arenas in which patients are actually going to be put at risk of harm. I will stop there. I believe that's my last slide, and turn it over to the next speaker.
All right. Thank you, Jim. So our next speaker is a tag team from BioReference Laboratories and GeneDx, Dr. Mark Rodman, who is the CEO of GeneDx, and David Liss, the Vice President of External Relations for BioReference Laboratories and GeneDx. David?
Thank you, Mike. This is David Liss with BioReference and GeneDx. And if you come away from nothing else from what I'm going to say. I want you to have a sense of how far along we are in the process. We are not at the start of FDA seeking to do this. We are not at the start of legislators looking at this. This has been going on for quite a while. And so we're going to go through a timeline of what's been happening so that you have a sense of where we are and a sense of really the urgency of the need to act. We're going to start with the House of Representatives. The Energy and Commerce Committee is the committee of jurisdiction. And you may recall that they're the ones who initially introduced the 21st Century Cures Act, which is a wonderful bill that looks at all sorts of ways of moving forward medical research, precision medicine, including increasing funding for NIH. You would think that in that bill it would be natural to have this LDT language, and the subcommittee had drafted language on the regulation of LDTs that was very much FDA-centric. The Cures Act did pass in the full House in July of last year, but the LDT language was taken out because there was no consensus among the impacted stakeholders. And frankly, it's unclear if there is consensus in the committee now. The Health Sub has 18 Republicans. It has 13 Democrats. Both appear to support a bigger role for the FDA. But both parties also stay true to form. So some Republicans are concerned about the expansion of the FDA, which is consistent with their governing philosophy. Some Democrats are concerned about interfering with the guidance, which is consistent with a pro-regulatory philosophy. So we can do the math and see that it would take 16 votes on the subcommittee, majority plus one, to really get them to move towards a CLIA-centric modernization model. And much of what you're going to hear, much of the call to action that you're going to hear is to try and move things towards a CLIA-centric model and to work with Congress and work with the administration towards that. In January, the Energy and Commerce, this just past January, Energy and Commerce staff convened a group of stakeholders to advise them on the next version of their legislation. But the folks who were convened were actually folks who had to agree that the existing bill, the existing FDA-centric approach, was the right approach. And so we do have some concerns that because there's a limited set of inputs, nobody was sitting around that table calling for CLIA-centric, that we wouldn't see major changes in the legislation in this next version. Next slide, please. Continuing with the House of Representatives, House goes out of session July 15th, but we are all living in the real world. We watch the news, and so we know that this is an election year. The reality is that things are going to move pretty fast. Legislation must pass out of the subcommittee by mid-April, must pass out of the full committee by around mid-May, because folks are just going to be very caught up in the elections, both in their own re-elections and in the presidential election. So we have to see this pass out of the full House before the July 4th recess, and that's going to be a challenge for the House. But then it must be reconciled with the Senate. We're going to talk a little bit more about the Senate, but it's unlikely that we're going to see all this take place. And as we talk about where the Senate is going, you'll see why. But here I want to stop and point out that we have our job. Job number one is to reach out to the Energy and Commerce Committee and to urge support for a CLIA-based solution, to direct their attention. And you're going to hear some similarities between all of the goals that I present, because they're all going to really involve two things. One is going to be educating policymakers about what you do and how this will affect you, how the change in policy, moving to an FDA-centric approach, will affect your laboratories and your patients. And, of course, the other similarity you're going to hear among these recommendations is that you go out there and urge for a CLIA-based approach. Next slide, please. So we're going to the Senate now, and the timeline on the Senate is also pretty tortured. The Committee of Jurisdiction is Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions, known colloquially as HELP. And HELP, to its credit, really sought bipartisan approach to enhancing regulation. But reportedly, Republicans and Democrats have been unable to reach consensus on that balance between FDA and CLIA oversight models. And as does happen, communication then slows down a little bit. The fact is that at least as we understand it, at least has been reported to us, Republicans on the Health Committee have been leaning towards a CLIA-centric model. It's been reported to us that Democrats have been leaning towards a more FDA-centric model. And so that really points to what our second job is. It's to share with members of the Health Committee, and particularly if your institution has a member who is on the Health Committee, to share with those policymakers what you expect the impact of the draft guidance could be on your laboratory, on your institution. Urge them to support a CLIA-centric approach. And that's really just a critical set of messages for folks in the Senate to hear. Next slide, please. Again, this is not happening. You're not at the beginning of the process. You're well into the process. And when folks like me look at what happens on the Hill, well, we see there's a need to pass bills, and sometimes bills are very specific about specific programs. The 21st Century Cures bill, for example, was all about, or act was, the bill was all about medical innovation. But there are a number of bills that simply have to pass every year because of the important function that they play. And in this slide, we're going to look at some must-pass bills that are relevant to laboratory-developed tests and which could serve as vehicles for the existing House language on LDTs, which is FDA-centric, and perhaps this language could ride on one of these bills. Eventually, something has to be done with cures, with the 21st Century Cures bill. I mean, it did pass in the House, in the full House, by 344 to 7. Huge bipartisan support to advance medical research. So the Senate is now holding hearings on their version of that legislation or on related pieces of legislation. In fact, there's going to be a hearing in the Senate Health Committee on March 9th and then a final one scheduled for April 6th. And so presumably everyone's going to want to do something about medical innovation, and that might provide an opportunity for language on laboratory-developed tests, and that's something we're really going to be keeping a sharp eye out for. Also, the prescription drug user fee and medical device user fee amendments both expire in next September of 2017. MEDUFA, in particular, can not only authorize the FDA's action, but it could provide a funding mechanism, because what the user fee amendments do is that they pull dollars from the industry to pay for these policies. And so it's not hard to imagine including laboratories in such an effort to find user fees to help pay for the FDA's actions. Well, these bills really do have to pass, and the process has begun. The FDA has already begun the process of leading to reauthorization, and Congress can be holding hearings next session. So job number 3 is to urge the inclusion of CLIA-centric reform in any germane legislation that winds up passing. So we're going to have to keep a sharp eye out to make sure that a negative FDA-centric language that you can explain. You need to go out and explain why FDA-centric language would be harmful for your practice, for your laboratories, for your patients. And you have to move. You have to really get out and give that message. Next slide, please. The FDA has been busy with this. Congress was notified in July of 2014 to give you a sense of when this started. There was a statutory requirement that the FDA notify Congress if they were to do such a thing. The draft guidance was then issued in October of 2014. The comment period closed in February of 2015. The FDA will not release another draft. They've publicly stated that the next time they release the guidance, it will be the final version. So there will not be another opportunity for comment. We don't know the timing. It's unclear on when that will be released. The FDA has indicated that it might be the end of the first quarter soon. It might be this early in the second quarter. So we're really looking at a very tight timeline of what has to happen next. Frankly, it's one of the reasons we were so anxious to speak with you. This is happening, and it's happening sooner rather than later. So job number 4, itemize and quantify the expected impact of the draft guidance because such information will be needed if a lawsuit is filed. The laboratory industry has indicated that it may file a lawsuit if the FDA finalizes the guidance. Data will be important in order for that lawsuit to be successful. To give you a sense of the urgency, of the need to act, I'm now going to hand the microphone over to Dr. Grodman for the next part of the presentation.
David, thank you very much. And I want to commend every speaker on this call, on this webinar. Having been involved intimately in this issue for probably more than a dozen years, I've rarely seen so many speakers be so on point and convey as sharp and concerted message about what we face. A lot of people use the analogies of shoulders nowadays. What I mean by that is anyone who talks about the promise of precision medicine in the coming decades, everyone who talks about how we can affect patients' lives, all of those efforts will be built on the shoulders of the people on this call. We've changed and allowed medicine to evolve. We all need to be proud of what's happened, but we can't stop there. For any of you on this call, and there are many, who have validated a new test, a new procedure this year, for all of you who've done that in a commercial setting, in an academic setting, in a hospital setting, any of you who've gone in and brought in a new idea and a new thought and brought it into reality, your life, your work will change. And we don't know how, because what we are ushering in is a period with regards to what we've done, a period of uncertainty that is going to change and will be changed and different for generations. Dr. Watson put it right. We're looking at a period of faith-based oversight. But the uncertainty is something that makes it hard for us to do the best work of which we're able. We have no regulatory framework, clearly, on how it will work under any proposal. There is no estimation, as you've heard, on what this is going to cost all of you, all of us, to be able to comply with however this framework evolves. Given the massive numbers of new laboratory-developed procedures every year, we could only estimate the massive investment that's going to be required in new infrastructure under any of their proposals to be able to do this, when we have an existing infrastructure in CLIA today that needs modification. There are differences of opinion, but I truly believe that an essential part of our problem is a lack of understanding and an understanding of the expertise we possess to do what is so necessary. I'm a physician. I've used the tests. I operate laboratories. We've brought many to market. When you bring people in to your laboratories, when they see what it takes to diagnose a new leukemic and get therapy started within 24 hours, when they see what it takes to go in and diagnose a genetic order of a 4-year-old with seizures, it's clear to those who witness it that this is medicine. This is not a device. This is what everyone on this call does. And most of what we deal with is those who don't really comprehend or have seen or witnessed what the realities of what we often will do every day. But we have to be realistic, because even though there is, I believe, a basis of not understanding what we do, there are those who will use regulation, and regulation cannot be used to promote economic or competitive advantage for a few in the name of patient safety. What we do is too valuable to be lost. you know BioReference and GeneDx. You know who we are. We're a commercial entity, and I've often been asked, why do I have taken such a consistently strong position on this? It's because, as a physician, I really believe we as a community have an obligation. We have an obligation not to protect what we've done, but an obligation to protect what we will do in the future. We can't be satisfied what's happened. We have to be hungry for what can be done to make it better and put ourselves in an environment to be able to achieve those goals. So, this is a call for help. It's a call for action. We have to define who we are. We can't allow others to define who we are. We have the expertise to guide the discussion. We have the expertise to come up with the solutions. We have the expertise to be able to go in and find ways to go bring all parties together, away from any partisan interests, but to be able to go in and do the right thing for patients. Because if we don't, what we do is going to change. We can't let that happen. Mike, I'm going to hand it over to you now.
All right. Thank you, Mark. So I want to remind folks on the call that you can ask questions. There is a Q&A box on the screen. If you type your questions into the box, we'll try to get back to them shortly after a brief summary. So obviously, we want you to assess the impact of these potential oversight mechanisms on your laboratory and its viability. And if access to important testing or the viability of your lab seem to be placed at risk, we strongly encourage you to write to your own representatives, to the committees with jurisdiction over these issues in the Energy and Commerce Committee in the House and in the Senate Health Committee. We also want to suggest to those who are on this call from academic medical centers, just to remind you that most major academic medical centers in the United States have their own government affairs staff. And if you feel that your laboratory is being placed in jeopardy for access to testing for patients in your institution, then we strongly encourage you to be in contact with those folks within your own institution. That'll add to your own voice as you begin to address these issues. Now, to summarize briefly the key messages that we have heard today, the medical genetics community clearly has too little information. We don't know what tests, we don't know what the costs of compliance are going to be. So too little information is available to us to know what proposed oversight won't cause more harm to access to genetic testing in the United States than good. A CLIA-centric approach appears most viable in ensuring patient safety and access, and that those developing and finalizing oversight plans should include individuals with expertise and training in medical genetics and genomics. We strongly encourage you in your letters to offer your assistance where it can be made available to those trying to answer these difficult questions. And that there are concerns that giving explicit authority to the FDA through legislation that may come up in the very near future that would allow FDA or give FDA the authority to regulate LDTs is actually worse than maintaining the status quo would be, which does at least leave litigation on the table as a possible solution if we can't come to a outcome that will support patient access to enormous number, really, something in the neighborhood of 60,000 rare disease tests that are currently available in genetics. Next slide, please. Thank you. So we're going to try to help you some in preparing yourselves to communicate with your own legislatures and with committees. We have prepared a draft letter. Unfortunately, we finished it just before this call, so we don't have the URL, but tomorrow we will be sending everybody who is participating and registered for this call an email that will include links to the draft letter, information on the names and addresses of your own representatives, and copies of the slides from these presentations that you can use to inform your own communication. So we encourage you to communicate with your representatives. We want you to offer your expertise towards finding that workable path towards patient safety and access. And now we can take some questions and answers. So the first question is for Dr. Evans. Dr. Evans mentioned that the highest risk scenarios that have already passed have resulted from overly aggressive marketing. How would a CLIA-centric approach to regulation address those situations?
Yeah, what I would envision would be the targeting or basically a system of red flags that could pay the most attention to those types of scenarios. What I'm trying to get away from is the idea that we can simply look at any test in a vacuum and assess risk. I don't really think that's possible as a clinician. Again, where I've seen problems occur, and where I think one sees the problems in, for example, the FDA's list of 20 problematic case histories, is when those tests are marketed aggressively, when they make silly claims. So what I really would advocate for within that CLIA-centric context would be some provision or focus on the claims that are made, because I think that points directly to where the risk is.
All right, thank you. So our next question is not for anyone in particular. It reads, is it safe to assume and include in our comments to legislators that FDA moving forward will place labs and patients in the United States at a disadvantage compared to our counterparts in other countries?
Well, I want to be clear about something. This is Sylvia from the AMA. The disadvantage is in no small part due to the fact that there is tremendous confusion and lack of clarity. Several years ago, I heard a presentation from an innovator outside of the context of physicians and clinicians, but who had indicated that in terms of investing in highly innovative and disruptive areas of practice, that the biggest barrier wasn't necessarily regulatory, although onerous regulatory regimes did lock innovative participants out of the market and prevented the development of a full ecosystem of solutions, which is quite obviously one of our concerns. But interestingly enough, the person said that it was the lack of predictable, consistent guidance that was readily able to provide those who are regulated the rules of the road for how to proceed forward, that it was that lack of transparency on the part of the regulators about what their expectations were, and that there was a constant moving the ball that really created the insurmountable barriers to innovation and clinical advancement. So I would note that Dr. Watson's characterization and Dr. Grodman's characterization of the tremendous confusion and lack of clarity really is troublesome, because it may all be well and good that those who are developing these reform models have an elegant solution. It is not all well and good that those who have to implement them and operate under them do not operationally know how to comply with them, and that they could be quite unworkable. And that is really where your role is essential in providing subject matter expertise and thinking very carefully in a targeted way about how this will impact your laboratory. This is going to happen. Let me also be clear about that in case it's not. There's legislation and there's FDA proposed guidance. The FDA proposed guidance can be finalized at any time. So this is not an academic exercise with some hypothetical possible endpoint. It is a real endpoint. It is going to happen, and it likely is going to happen sooner rather than later. Now would be the time for you to think very long and hard about how it impacts your practice.
All right, thank you, Sylvia. So we have the same question many times. Yes, we will make our slides available to you tomorrow. We will provide you with information on how you can find your own representatives, and we will provide you with the names of the members of the committees with jurisdiction over these issues and to whom messages should be sent. So I'd like to thank our speakers today, Sylvia Trujillo from the AMA, Jim Evans from the University of North Carolina, David Liss and Mark Rodman from BioReference Lab and GeneDx. We appreciate your attention, and we hope you're able to follow up on the important communications that will hopefully get the message of the broader community to those who are making these decisions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike.